we don't actually almost never look at share prices, because that's not what the industry should be doing.
Hello, I'm Natalie Kenway, Global Head of ESG Insights at ESG Clarity, and welcome to the final part of this two-part video series with Stuart Dunbar at Baillie Gifford. So in the first episode, we talked about shortcomings in quantitative approaches to ESG, why divestment from the biggest polluters isn't helpful, and the inaccuracies in data based on the paper he had written titled The Rise of ESG. So to conclude this series, I want to ask Stuart how Baillie Gifford gets around these challenges and its approach to engagement to ensure the companies is investing in are truly aligned with the transition to a sustainable economy. Firstly, Stuart, you talk about ESG-friendly governance. What do you mean by this? Is that different from your standard governance, bearing in mind the G in ESG is for governance?
What I mean by that is, so I'm talking about governance in the context of how management run companies, rather than necessarily how we invest for clients. So that's really about, I mean, something that we're very interested in is what is the attitude of the management in the companies that we're investing in for clients, because that's a massive determinant of how willing companies are to address things like environmental damage and social equity, and how they treat all the stakeholders, and you know, everything that everybody talks about. But for us, again, that's not an exercise in metrics, that's an exercise in talking directly to companies. So we have funnily enough, I wouldn't want to say we don't necessarily do more company meetings than other firms. I don't know if that would be real, but we certainly do hundreds and hundreds of company meetings. But I think the key point is, what did you discuss with management when you get there? So we spend a lot of time, by nature, our investment horizon is very long anyway. So even, you know, whole other discussion about whether ESG is even a thing, or it's just a framework for thinking about the long term, which I would argue has kind of always existed in some companies anyway, or some investment companies. But when you take the time to talk to management, which we will typically do 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year or something for the companies we invest in, do we actually discuss with them what their attitudes are to improvement? And that's what I'm calling ESG friendly governance. There's a lot of companies out there that either just aren't thinking about it, or work within structures that are misaligned. So it's very difficult for the management of businesses who might be on 12 or 24 month bonus structures aligned to earnings growth, for example. You know, if that's your incentive, it would take some sort of very selfless individual to reduce company earnings in the interests of spending more on environmentally sound practices, if it's actually going to torpedo your bonus 24 months down the line because it's going to impact earnings. You know, so these are very real issues that I don't think are yet fully considered in a lot of companies. Now, there are many entities out there thinking about this. So we're members of quite a few of them, and whether it's there's one called Focusing Capital in the Long Term, there's various other investor forums who argue for this greater alignment, embedding of long-termism in the management of companies. So we try and think about all that. We try and engage with companies and understand whether or not they have the correct incentive structures in place to allow them to actually think and act long-term. And, you know, that even takes you into things like something I find very interesting about the implications of ESG is, are institutional shareholders in particular becoming longer term because of this? Now, if they are, I think that's a very positive thing, because that then naturally leads to a rethinking of alignment of incentives and a willingness to forgo short-term profitability in some of these companies in order to secure sounder business practices in the long term. So, you know, this could be a very positive development, but I guess the key point here is there's still this, there are still huge challenges around whether management of companies are truly in a position to worry about, are we environmentally sound on a 10-year view? Now, where I think you'd have to argue that companies that have not got to grips with those issues are less likely to be successful investments, because the working thesis here, and it looks pretty real to me, is as ESG issues have risen in importance for customers of companies and through the political process by regulators, I think it's pretty safe to assume that companies that don't act responsibly in a broad sense will find themselves deserted by their customers or regulated into non-profitability. Mm-hmm. So one of the points I made in the paper is that I think all this discussion around ESG is actually creating, I hope it's creating a long-termism in investors that ought to have always existed, but probably didn't. So there's a bit of a sort of indirect thing here, which is ESG has led us to rethink long-termism, and possibly it's changing the whole financial system for the better and refocusing on back on this sort of real capital deployment in the real world. It's not sitting looking at share prices all day. We don't actually almost never look at share prices, because that's not what the industry should be doing.
We've covered quite a bit on ESG credentials being linked to executive pay. And yes, it would be interesting to see how that pans out. You've also touched on the asset management industry being heavily regulated, but you talk in the paper about self-regulation too. Can you explain what you mean by that and why it's necessary?
I think it is very, very difficult for external government regulators to legislate for climate change. Let's take climate change as the most obvious example. So I think the framework in which to think about this is regulators using the investment management industry in particular as a proxy for regulation. So if something's too complicated to legislate for, you can put in place long-term goals such as, Paris alignment, net zero. But what's really going on here is they're trying to create a framework in which the industry itself is compelled to tackle these challenges. So I think that's kind of where I'm going with self-regulation. What I mean by that is the industry itself can create frameworks. So for example, there's a net zero asset managers initiative, which incidentally we have not signed up for. We likely will, but we want to fully understand the implications of it rather than just sort of sign up and move on. And many other initiatives across the industry, which brings, this is what I would call self-regulation. It brings meaningful goals and targets which we can implement, because we as an investment management industry have the resources to think about this at an individual company level to actually bring about the change that does get us to net zero, whatever your target is. I think it's really good that there are these collaborative groups springing up that do create frameworks in which we can all hopefully act. And that does then get us to the right place. But that, I would describe that as self-regulation in the sense that that's far more detailed and far more likely to have meaningful impacts than any government can possibly do by putting in place a framework for how companies have to operate. So you do have, obviously, TCFD, you've got SFDR in our own industry, you've got various regulations happening, but I think that only gets you so far. That has to translate into reality. So for instance, I mean, SFDR, I'm sure people will be very familiar with that, is a really interesting topic. You've got this sort of European Union-led challenge to the industry to think about how sustainability is built into your funds, but it's deliberately very loosely defined. So individual companies can decide what they mean by that and then evidence and categorize. We're thinking very, very hard about that, but I bring that up because I just think it's an example of this is really hard work. It's really detailed. It's a very complex system-wide problem, and all the external regulators can do is really create a broad framework that we have to go and do the hard work within. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in that. I mean, I think it's a good approach actually, because I think we have experiences historically that when regulators get heavy-handed with the investment industry, it can have quite unintended consequences. So So sort of allowing that much flexibility in the system, I think, is probably the right way to do it. We'll see.
Yes, that completely makes sense. And the regulatory stories that we run on ESG Clarity are very popular, particularly the ones about SFDR. So recently, ESG Clarity and Last Word Media Titles launched a campaign for better governance, as we felt that some investment companies were asking the companies they invest in to be diverse, have high ESG credentials, but weren't necessarily looking inwardly at what their own sort of business was doing. So is that something that you would agree with, that you've seen in the asset management industry, or do you have any thoughts on the campaign?
My take on that would be we've actually seen a step up in taking responsibility for the carbon footprint of our own activities. Now, I don't know what the numbers are, but I can't imagine the asset management industry has a particularly significant carbon footprint in the grand scheme of things. So I will come on to, I'm not dodging the question, I'll come back and talk about how we're thinking about our own carbon footprint. But I think it's important to make the point first that the way that by far, by orders of magnitude, the most positive thing we can do is how we deploy capital to solutions providers that are tackling these social and environmental changes, and then engagement with management and everything that we've been talking about. So I actually think it's important to lead by example, but it's almost a bit of a distraction from how we can seriously try and do something good for society. Leaving that aside, I can talk about what we do. I'm sure other managers are doing this. We have set our own carbon footprint goals. I mean, leaving aside our carbon footprint will be significantly lower at the moment for obvious reasons. But even leaving that aside, we're committed to halving it by 2025. Now, we do things which are short-term, frankly, not the right answer. So we double offset at the moment. So, you know, there are lots of short-term things you can do, but I think most people would agree that offsetting is not solving the problem, it's moving the problem. So, you know, we do that for the time being, but much more key to how we think about this, other than through the investment side, is, you know, how much do we really need to travel? It's simple stuff like efficiency of buildings. So I don't think it's a secret that we're planning to move office in coming years, and you know, one of the aspects of that is how do you dramatically reduce the carbon footprint of your office space? These are quite big things. You know, I don't think, I'm really not in the camp that says that moves the dial much on the challenges that the world has, but I do think everybody, the way to address some of this stuff is everybody has to do what they can to, you know, I realize that's a sort of slightly pointless statement, but it's an important one. Everyone has to realize this is their problem. So we're trying to do that as a firm. And even, I mean, I'm quite heartened by the fact that this is now so high on everybody's agendas, and you know, that extra trip to go and see a client on the other side of the world is now something that we might not do, or we'll at least think very hard about. There are some companies out there that are doing really smart things. So Microsoft, I think, has got a high and increasing internal carbon cost for its activities. So the people that work there are forced to think about externalities in investment decision making, that sort of stuff. So we haven't gone down that road, but I think we should all be thinking hard about how this impacts our own daily activities.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the industry has changed permanently in some aspects like that. So how does Baillie Gifford engage with companies? What are the key questions you ask at the different stages of investment? I
guess that gets right to the heart of it. So this is all about engagement with companies, and it varies because it depends very much on the life cycle of individual companies. So I mean, we invest in some private companies as well as public companies. And, you know, when they're small and private, it's all about ambition and where are they trying to go with the company, and if they're not, you know, you might have a discussion about attitude to sustainability. You probably will, because it's going to be built into their chances of long-term growth and success. But it's a much lesser discussion at that point. If it's life and death in a young company, you're not going to fret all that much, I think, about, you know, how much should we travel. That then changes dramatically as companies get bigger, and then at the opposite end of the scale, with some of the very large companies we invest in, it's really a process of engagement. One of the challenges I think we have as a company is engagement for improvement tends to be best done, in our opinion, through robust but quiet private conversations with management. So we spend, you know, I could give you a list as long as my arm of companies that we've met with the senior independent director, or we've met with the chairman, or we've met with the sustainability committee or head of sustainability, whatever it happens to be, and had really useful discussions about, you know, what should you disclose? Is your disclosure good enough? At what level of seniority do you consider environmental and social factors within your business? You know, that's where it would be very easy for us to say, we've had all these conversations. So when companies have committed to carbon targets, or they've done this, that, or the other thing, which is good from a ESG point of view, well, that must have been us because we discussed it with them. Now, I don't think we should do that. I don't think we as a firm should do it. But also, I get. Do you know the phrase "success has many fathers"? I suspect what goes on is that when companies do improve their attitude towards environmental issues, every fund manager that ever spoke to them says we're claiming credit for that. And I think that's a slightly peculiar situation, and we would all do ourselves a service by recognizing that this is back to your collaboration point. So we have loads of these types of discussions. We don't generally then jump up and down and say we fixed that, because I think that would be a claim too far. But if you are in a world of engagement rather than a world of metrics, it actually makes it much more difficult to demonstrate the impact you're having. It's funny, just as a brief aside, I puzzle about how the industry is using the impact word now, because impact now seems to be describing a certain category of fund in which the primary concern is, what is this company producing, and therefore what impact is it having on the world, which is all very well. But impact to me also means every company has an impact on the world through its operations. And there's also, how do we impact the company through our engagement process with the company? So I realize I'm sort of splitting hairs here, but I think some of the language around this leads us to oversimplify the reality of trying to encourage company management to think about the long term. I suppose the other thing, just to come back to this point on who do we spend our time talking to, and it comes back to this point about, well, for us at least, as growth investors, quite aggressive growth investors in some cases, we're not trying to talk to every company out there. We've probably got about 90% of our assets, client assets, in 200 companies. We have about 100 or so equity investors, plus some multi-asset and fixed income, and we have a separate governance and sustainability team of about 25 people. So there's a whole lot of people who are all thinking about this. And to be clear, I think that ESG matters need to be fully embedded in investment decision making. It's not, although we have a separate team, they need to work very closely with, you know, they're a center of excellence, if you like, but they need to work closely with the investment decision makers. But that's a lot of people for, you know, a relatively concentrated investment exposure. And even within that, there are certain things that we're interested in which tend to be, so good growth investments tend to be those that are aligned with solving society's big problems anyway. So things like, we think there's a health revolution going on, for example, sort of personalized healthcare type stuff through gene sequencing and everything else. You know, there's things, you did an article, I know, actually recently on the future of food. So we're very interested in synthetic biology. And so that's, how do you create protein from plant rather than from animals? But it's also things like sustainable materials in the apparel industry, all that sort of stuff. My point I'm trying to get to is it's about engaging with those companies that have got really exciting, for us, it's growth prospects. Let's back to the point, let's not forget it's about the investment opportunity. But that coincides very neatly, in my opinion, with companies that are coming up with solutions to these big problems. So that's where we focus most of our effort, and we have very, very detailed discussions on their business, including the sustainability within that.
So finally, what are your hopes and aspirations for the investment industry from a governance and engagement perspective?
Well, here's a strange answer. I'd like it if the industry would stop obsessing over the stock market, because it's not the point. The point is real capital deployment into companies that are providing better services and newer ways of doing things, and that these days incorporates more environmentally friendly ways and more socially just ways of doing things. So rather bizarrely, I'd love it if the investment industry would stop obsessing about stock prices and start focusing on the real progress in real businesses over sort of 5-year plus horizons. I think that's what matters, and I think that that's been a major problem for the industry since long before anyone put an ESG badge on it. We need to take responsibility for where's the world going to be in 30 years. We have I think it's really important to be humble about what we do in our industry, but we also need to reflect on the incredible power we have to influence the world through investing huge amounts of other people's money. And that brings with it a responsibility to say, well, what kind of world are we going to live in 20 or 30 years' time? And the good news is, I think that's entirely consistent with investing in the best possible way we can to generate returns for our clients. But we perhaps all need to move to a point where we understand that that's actually the same activity. It's not an opposing activity. Thinking about what's the world going to look like in 30 years does not undermine our efforts to maximize returns for clients. It's actually the same job.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you very much for sharing all of your insights. It's clear to see this is a topic that you're extremely passionate about. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, appreciate it.